Okay, we're going to come back in a couple of minutes and talk very specifically about the different routes to get to that yes that you just talked about, how you can continue to have an oil and gas industry, which Prime Minister Trudeau said a couple of weeks ago that there is no solution to climate change without the oil and gas industry being part of that solution, and how you can have that in a world with emissions coming down. But for a moment, let's stick with today and the news. We've dealt with Biden, but let's talk about the vaccine for a moment, because there's some news today on, just in case people watch this at a later date, we're talking on Monday, and I'm going to say 12:15 Mountain Time, and deference to you, Mark. So it's just afternoon Mountain Time, and stock markets are popping on the news that there's been some good testing on vaccines. And oil and gas companies are, including your own, are up very, very sharply today. So what message are you taking from that?
Well, I think part of it is the market's been very short-term focused, as have the companies to a large degree, because everybody's focused on cash preservation, drive down your costs, get things sorted out. And because there's been kind of no end in sight. I remember back, like, honestly, it's almost embarrassing now, back in May and June, some of the things I said to our employees, where you think, okay, wait a minute, our infection rate is declining. The hospitals, at one point, this was all about trying to make sure we didn't overwhelm our emergency wards and hospitals. So now you start seeing, okay, capacity is freeing up, our infection rate's declining. This looks really, really positive, not knowing that, okay, a year from now, we might be getting out from under this. Obviously, vaccine is a huge lever to be able to resume normal life, whatever that means now in this environment, because obviously lots has changed. But the markets are reacting to the news that came out today with two companies essentially saying that their phase 3 trials have gone very well. They're getting 90% effectiveness associated with it, and that some of this product could be on the market here this year, at the end of this year. Interestingly, this was a hotly debated topic in the US election, but yeah, it does appear that this is coming. Very credible organizations. They've been doing an enormous amount of work on it. So this is a very big positive. So at-home stocks are going down, and I would say traditional economy stocks are going up today, and in the oil patch it's somewhere between 10 and 30%, right? Like, these are huge. I think the Dow's up almost 5% today.
And Air Canada stock is up sharply. So there's some feeling that people will return more quickly to a normal that involves moving themselves around the cities, the world. They will be transportation will come back.
I think that's right. I mean, the people that I've talked to, there's people that are very anxious to get back and go and do these trips that they missed or whatever it is. I think in the airline industry, the companies themselves would say, look, it takes years to get it back, but the first steps forward will be quite significant. And with utilization so low, this is huge for them.
Yeah, you have a unique window into what's happened so far, because you see energy consumption very closely, and you see consumer behavior, particularly through your Petrocan stations and through demand for aviation fuel. So what have we seen up to now? What have the effects been, and how much have we recovered already from the low points in the spring?
Yeah, it's a great question. We lost, 20% of world demand actually disappeared literally within a few weeks, as you saw the whole northern hemisphere getting locked down, which are the primary consumers of energy. And so that was very, very significant. In oil and gas now, I would say, I don't know exactly what the global numbers are. I think it's probably somewhere between 8 and 10% down. The biggest challenge is jet fuel is off huge. Jet fuel is still off, 50, 60%. And so transportation with airlines, but gasoline and distillate has been pretty strong. In Canada, it's been in the kind of 5 to 10% range that we've been down in gasoline and distillate. Jet fuel can get blended into the diesel barrels, so we're seeing inventories are a bit challenging, but for quite several months now, we've been drawing diesel, gasoline, and crude inventories. And so the market's slowly coming back into balance. The faster demand comes back, the faster we'll come back into balance. But again, all of this is kind of the market dynamic. We still have to deal with carbon and emissions associated with it. So, but it is interesting to see the markets. And what I would say we're seeing a little bit is, at first, gasoline was way down and the diesel barrel was much stronger with industrial activity. But now you're seeing that gasoline's been quite strong. And I think more people are driving, less are using public transit, those sorts of things. To keep themselves safe through this. So we've seen quite a few back and forths with the market through this entire period.
Yeah, I hear people complaining about traffic again, so maybe that's a good sign of the economy. So let's move into a more future-oriented perspective here, a more strategic and structural perspective of where markets are going. We have a carbon problem in the world. We have climate change. We have people very anxious about it. We have it a dominant feature in the politics of many countries, including our own country. So let's paint a picture. Let's paint two pictures if we could, actually, because there's two targets out there that people seem to be aiming for. One is the Paris Agreement targets of 2030, and the other is the net zero target of 2050. So I'm wondering, as you do your work getting ready for those times, what will the industry look like in 2030? How far along will we have gone? And then we'll go to 2050, because I take it that's a different track in many ways. But if that's a wrong assumption, you can put them together.
Well, part of it, Ed, is nobody really knows the answer to it directionally. There's a number of technologies that are available that are getting deployed. And some of them are alternate energy, like wind farms and solar panels, but some of them are things like carbon sequestration and looking at different ways to deal with emissions, like the example I gave you on our Fort Hills project. So both of these levers are getting pulled. We've seen more wind farms and solar panels in the last 5 or 10 years than we've seen ever. And so there's been a massive focus on it. And despite that, oil demand prior to COVID was going up at about 1% a year. Some view that it's structurally down, and so that we've hit peak and we'll never be back. Some people believe that no, we'll go back and you'll start to see this demand come back. But part of the issue with it is it's infrastructure. So for us to get to a net zero world, it's kind of like, okay, well, we need different transportation. We need different planes. We need to make steel differently. Concrete needs to look different. We need different, we probably need to shift a whole bunch of stuff to things like carbon fiber, which is very expensive right now. So there's lots of changes. I think what you'll see by the time we get to 2030, you'll see a lot of focus on efficiencies, that renewables will still maintain a significant focus associated with it. From 2030 to 2050, I think you'll see far more fundamental change and things like, will we go back and start building a whole bunch of nuclear plants in the country? Maybe so, maybe not. But you'll start seeing much bigger technology plays come post 2030. But even when you get out to 2050, I think a lot of people view that, okay, well, oil demand will be zero. And none of the studies that we've seen show that oil demand is zero. Today, it's about, prior to COVID, it was about 100 million barrels a day. And a lot of people believe that by the time you get to 2050, it could be in the 60 to 70 million barrels a day, because it's used for everything from asphalt, fibers for the textile industry, plastics, containers, medical supplies, food, there's just all sorts of different dimensions that are associated with the industry, and a lot of these are not going away. And so this is the challenge and it's why it's so complicated. It's not just like, hey, we use a little bit of it, shut it off. It's kind of like, okay, we need to reinvent a lot of different things associated with it. And we think we can deal with the emissions and continue to provide a lot of the products going forward. But there's a lot of work to be done.
Well, even the world of electric cars, which we've been hearing about for a long time, and right now I think new car sales in Canada, only about 4% of them are electric, which is pretty low. The government of Canada has a goal by 2040 that 100% of new car sales will be electric, but it has targets along the way, and it's already behind those targets. But even let's say we met 2040 and 100% of cars are electric, there'll still be 10 or 15 years worth of cars on the road from the internal combustion age that are left. So I guess we must be going at least till 2050, I suppose. That even in the car, even in the classic internal combustion engine.
Yeah, I think that's right. Is you're going to find, and then cars are the easiest part of the transportation system. When you get into the big heavy haulers and such, battery technology is more challenged because the batteries are very, very heavy. So now we're looking at things like, well, does hydrogen fit within the big heavy haulers? And what does that mean? It's interesting because in the oil and gas industry, we view hydrogen as a hydrocarbon. So, but I know, that people don't think of it that way, but hydrogen is significantly used within Canada today to make gasoline and jet fuel and diesel and such. I think as Suncor, we're probably one of the largest producers of hydrogen in the country, and I'm sure we're the largest consumer of hydrogen in the country. So I think we consume about 15% of all the hydrogen that's made in Canada.
You consume it for what purpose?
Well, it basically gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, and such is a combination of carbon and hydrogen. And so we make hydrogen to actually chemically engineer the fuels and products and stuff that are required. So hydrogen is used primarily to make the gasoline and diesel and what we're talking about, when people talk about hydrogen now, they're talking about removing the carbon from it, so it'll just be the hydrogen.
Right. Well, I wanted to talk about hydrocarbons for a moment. We have in past discussed this, and as you say, hydrocarbons are made up of hydrogen and carbon. I guess that's not an extensive example of my chemistry acumen, but they're made up of hydrogen and carbon. Is there a world out there where we separate the hydrogen into a clean fuel and the carbon into clean products? You mentioned before carbon fibers, and I think most people haven't heard of carbon fibers. Maybe you could describe what they are. But is there a world where we're going to take that hydrocarbon and have two different economic uses and economic products coming?
Yeah, I mean, there's a huge amount of focus on exactly that, is how do we take the CO2 out of the emissions side and either convert it to something that either sequester it through carbon sequestration, taking CO2 and putting it in the ground, or converting it to a solid that we can put into a landscape somewhere, or converting it to a useful product. It's interesting, like one of the initiatives we have underway, which we've worked with a number of companies within the industry, is we sponsored an X Prize. And the X Prize was really to incent companies to figure out what could we use CO2 for and make it a productive use piece associated with it. So some of it is we're looking at feedstocks for petrochemical plants through to actual materials. When you make materials, you have to do things to it. You have to concentrate it. You have to reorganize the chemistry associated with it, those sorts of things. But carbon fiber, in a lot of cases, is a potential replacement for some steel. You're starting to see it now in cars and sports equipment and things like that. Very light, very, very strong. And we can make it out of carbon molecules. And so there's lots of different things that are being explored, not just about this is a problem, but then how do you actually turn this into an opportunity? So carbon fiber is one of the key areas of focus.
Right. Well, I wonder how much potential if Canada has a competitive advantage in either of those areas, because as oil declines, and you said maybe we'll go from 100 million barrels a day to 60 or 70 barrels a day over a decades long period, that is going to mean that Canada's exports are going to decline because we're very heavily reliant on our energy economy and particularly on oil and gas. Canada runs a current account deficit, as you know, of about $60 billion a year, but it runs a surplus in oil and gas of about $70 billion a year, above and beyond what's imported into the East. So that's money that we can't easily lose. Does this world of hydrogen and carbon, is there a competitive advantage where Canada can regain some of that export activity and strength?
Yeah, actually, we have a number of huge advantages in this, and maybe just to characterize a couple of the numbers you mentioned is our oil and gas, or the resources sector, oil, gas, mining, and forestry, make up 50% of the country's exports, right? So this is huge. And so a lot of this is, okay, but how do we continue to export and deal with the climate goals and deal with the CO2 emissions and stuff associated with it? That's the challenge. We have, just in the base business, we have some huge advantages. The resource we have is massive. And so when you look at it, our decline rates for production, a lot of times production for a normal well or a conventional production will go up and then it declines over a period of time. And it can decline at 4 or 5% a year as an example. Shale, when you talk about shale often declines at 25 to 30% a year. So it has a huge decline rate. In Canada, when you get into the oil sands, our decline rates, we literally can produce with a bit of sustaining capital at flat production for decades. So that's huge for us, and it's a huge advantage in maintaining the production. So likely what's going to happen is when people stop investing, the production that's declining is what will create the decline. And there's an opportunity for Canada to maintain its production, maintain its financial strength for literally decades to come, while we deal with carbon emissions and invest in some of these other options. Do we have a strategic advantage in hydrogen or carbon fiber? There is a belief that taking the asphaltenes from our oil sands, which is the bottom portion of the barrel, asphaltenes sound a lot like asphalt, so you get a sense of these are very heavy, highly concentrated carbon. But there's a belief that that actually is a great source to make carbon fiber. If that's the case, that could be a huge win for Canada as a product that could get exported to the world. The other thing about it is, I was going to say hydrogen, because of our natural gas, we have a great position to be able to participate in hydrogen. And the other thing I would say is oil and gas is a huge investor in clean tech. Some of the numbers show that we're at 75% of all the money that's getting put into clean tech and invested in clean tech is coming from the oil and gas sector. I think the other piece of it is we have some great technologies in clean tech that will not only be able to help us in solving our challenges here, but hopefully this becomes a big leg of our export economy into the future as we go around the globe developing and delivering solutions for other countries to help deal with their carbon emissions and such as they go forward. So I think we have a lot of great levers in this, but obviously we need to support a strategy that actually makes that all work so that we can pull on all these levers and continue to drive our economy forward.
So the challenge is, I guess, leaving aside the consuming side of the equation, but the challenge is that production requires a lot of energy and burns a lot of energy, and that produces carbon emissions now. I think we've touched on a couple of the possible approaches, but I would just want to go back to two of them in particular. Electrification, rather than other methods of recovery, really electrifying. And you mentioned nuclear a while ago. There's a lot of talk around small modular reactors, and that Canada could take a lead in that. I want to know if Suncor sees potential there. And we've talked about carbon sequestration a couple of times. We talked about using the carbon, but storing the carbon. There was a huge project announced last week in the United Kingdom, or proposed, very early in the proposal stage, nonetheless, to bury carbon under the North Sea. 5 European oil companies involved in it and supported by a policy regimen. So there is, there's people to apply to as well and gain support. So I want to go down both those for a second. Let's start with the carbon sequestration. Do we have the policies in place in Canada to be a leader in that area? And of course, it's a basis for a hydrogen economy, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting, Ed. The way I would say it is, I think the desire is there, certainly in the province of Alberta and the federal government and the industry around, okay, so how can we work together to be able to move this forward? Given the geology, the history of production within the province of Alberta, the skills we have from drilling, completions, compression, dealing with gases and energy and all these sorts of things, I really think that Alberta and to some degree Saskatchewan could be global leaders in carbon sequestration. So that's a huge opportunity for us. And so we're trying to figure out, well, what's the path forward? And do we have all of the pieces associated with it to be able to do this really, really well? And so we're excited about that. Are all the pieces there? No, probably not. But you're seeing a very focused attention around, okay, so how do we do this and move this forward and start making a difference? Like one example on electrification that we've spent a lot of time on is we remove carbon from the barrel through our oil sands upgrader, and then we burn that carbon to actually make the steam to run our oil sands business. We've done it this way for 50 years. And so those boilers are coming to end of life. We tried to figure out what's the best way for us to move forward, given all these demands and such, and trying to figure out how to deal with climate. We're investing right now in, sorry about that. We're investing right now in trying to convert that now to a cogen. Now, somebody asked me about, well, did we consider wind farms and solar panels? And yes, we did. But you quickly realize it's like we need 3 million pounds of steam 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Like this is complicated. So we're in the process of putting in a cogen, and so we'll use natural gas to be able to make the steam. The cogen is very highly efficient.
Just tell people what cogen means.
Oh, cogen. So we burn natural gas. We use the exhaust from the turbine that's making electricity to heat water so that we can make steam. So you're making steam and electricity from burning 1 unit of natural gas. And so your steam that you're making, it's the most efficient from a hydrocarbon perspective and the lowest greenhouse gas emissions of anything that you could possibly produce. And then you get very low emissions for the electricity that you're producing. We're now planning to export 800 megawatts to the grid so that Alberta can carry on with their journey about shutting down coal-based power generation. This one project reduces greenhouse gas emissions by 2.5 megatons. Maybe that sounds like a lot, maybe it doesn't, but it's 0.3% of Canada's entire emissions are reduced by this one project at our base plant. So these are steps forward. Maybe it's not the ultimate step of where we end up, 20 years or 30 years from now, but it's a huge step forward for the industry and for our country.
Well, I guess that's what I meant, Mark, by a 2030 path and a 2050 path. In a way, a cogen seems to me very much a 2030 path. And then we will see if the small modular reactors are economical and safe, and they're kind of, I think some people compare them to nuclear submarines. They're very small and in that way, and there's a lot of practice with them. So perhaps they will lead to a much cleaner way of producing oil as well.
Yeah, it's interesting, Ed, just on that point is, so we've looked at that as a potential energy source for our in situ business. And so we think that if that worked, and we can do it safely, of course, and such as you could potentially produce zero emissions bitumen, at least in the production phase. And so if that's used for whether it's combustion or whatever, it's a huge step in being able to reduce our emissions and achieve net zero. So that's just one example. The other one is maybe we could take hydrogen and run it in our cogen to achieve something very similar, without actually going through to nuclear or carbon sequestration.
Okay, I want to invite Yolande back in a second. Let me just end this part of the discussion. I will I'll randomly select among one of my 15 remaining questions. Okay, here I come up with this one. You know, a lot of people are daunted by how difficult this will be and how expensive this will be. But there was a study out a couple of weeks ago by a new institute at Queen's University, the Institute for Sustainable Finance. And its report showed that the cost for Canada to achieve its 2030 climate goals would be $128 billion. Now, before the COVID pandemic, $128 billion used to sound like a lot of money. I'm not too sure what it sounds like anyhow, but that's $12.8 billion a year, which is a little less frightening, I suppose, in some ways. You know, less than 1% of Canada's GDP. And they say, you know, if oil were to abate at the rate that it contributes to emissions, about 27% of Canada's emissions a year, that would cost, they're figuring, $126 a ton. Some people say with better technology, that price would continue to go down. Are those numbers that should frighten us or encourage us?
Are you asking me, Ed?
I'm asking you. And you can answer both as a Suncor CEO and as a Canadian citizen.
You know, I think the challenge with it is I do think that there's going to be solutions. Technology has always been the answer. You know, we keep coming up against these massive challenges associated with it. And it's what drives innovation and technology and ideas that actually drive us forward. I think that every single one of these studies that I've seen is actually grounded on a certain set of assumptions about how technology will perform, how it can be deployed, how much it will cost, all these sorts of things associated with it. Every single step, every year we go forward, it gets less expensive, right? And so trying to find the path forward, I think, is super interesting. In some ways, it's like you said, it's kind of like, oh, well, with what we're dealing with COVID, this actually doesn't sound, you know, that significant. It's kind of like half price. But on the other hand, I think a lot of people are deeply concerned about the level of debt and the pace at which we're adding it to our balance sheet as a country. And so it's just trying to find the balance in there. What we do know is technology is the path forward. And I think from our perspective, at least, the simple answer about just demonizing oil and gas is actually not a helpful conversation, because it avoids us getting into the solution space about how do we work together and actually move the dial and actually change the future. And I think what I've noticed is, yes, there's more and more conversation about greenhouse gas emissions and the challenges we face, but there's also, I think, far more productive conversations that are coming forward about how do we really do this? What are the solution sets? How fast can we go? How do we change the future so it's fundamentally different? So I just told you one small project in Suncor that actually reduces Canada's emissions by 0.3%. Honestly, there are big opportunities for us as a country. We need to be able to engage and work across boundaries, because I think the solution is going to be all of our industries working together: agriculture, forestry, mining, oil and gas, along with manufacturing, clean tech, digital, all of these various pieces, because when we bring that together, we can make enormous progress. And we have so many great natural advantages. So I'm excited about the path forward. I think we will find that we can do it less expensively than what the study shows, although those numbers are far more realistic than several studies I heard previously. So I think it's both a concern and an encouragement.
Yeah, I guess it seems to me that if one could do it for $12 billion a year and create a carbon capture industry that exports expertise to the world and creates a hydrogen industry that is both unifying, because it would many different provinces in the country can produce hydrogen in different ways, and produces some of the other technology advantages, so creates jobs in for Canadians. And $12 billion, I don't want to be cavalier about $12 billion, but it's not as frightening a number as I would think that it might be to get a solution where you do have a safe environment and a healthy economy.